That's been a bit.
Microphone.
Are you happy now? Okay. Something that has been on my mind a little bit more recently with interviews that I've done with families that are interested in the school is I realize how often I'm dealing with people who have no denominational affiliation. So I want to talk about this enormous rising tide in American Christianity that I'll call non-denominationalism. I mean, I don't know what else to call it, since it's not a denomination. It is a fascination with congregations that are not affiliated with denominations. And so we're going to talk about this. Some of it might be a little bit surprising to you, but here's one thing I'll say. This is a very frustrating situation that's developed because, and this isn't new, but if I ask somebody about their church background, and they tell me, what's very frustrating is this is almost meaningless anymore. It doesn't really tell me much of anything. It will tell me, at most, the sort of kind of worship environment they're probably mostly accustomed to. But in terms of what I expect them actually to believe, what doctrinal background or foundations I actually expect them to have, if I'm talking to a committed Roman Catholic, I'm going to know a lot when they say I'm a committed. If I'm talking to a committed Lutheran, a committed Calvinist, I'm going to know a lot, but I'm almost never talking to one of those. I'm talking to somebody who has a spattering of different kinds of churches that they've gone to, but if I were to ask you, well, what kind of Christian are you? They would say, well, I don't really belong to a denomination. And even if they said they did, the likelihood is, if I started asking them what they believe, what I would get is a little of this and a little of that and a little of this over here. So even among those people who do have sort of a denominational affiliation, their actual understanding of what that is very minimal. So if I ask somebody what their church background is, I get almost nothing that's meaningful about what they believe. If I want to know what they believe, I have to start quizzing them. I've got to start asking about this and this and this and this, and then who knows what you're going to get. Part of the problem with somebody who has no denominational background and no theological understanding particularly, and by the way, those aren't the same thing. You can have somebody who is non-denominational but fairly savvy doctrinally, but they often are not, which means I don't even know how to ask them questions to elicit a response that will be meaningful to me, because it's all kind of homespun. So I don't know what they think about the Trinity. They've never really articulated it that way. So this is very frustrating, because every Christian becomes like their own brand new thing, and there's no way I can really kind of say, okay, well, this is where you're coming from, and so these are some things that I can assume. Or if we're going to have a discussion about what you believe compared to what we believe here, here's some points that we need to address. I have no idea. I simply have to go through all this stuff. And probably they're not going to understand an awful lot of what I'm saying. Now, there's two different problems there. One is the fact that they have no denominational affiliation. The second is they have no theological education. Okay? So we don't have a common language. This is very frustrating. Universally, or almost universally, there will be a certain antipathy, antagonism toward denominations. Denominations among American Christians have a tendency to be kind of a negative, it's a bad word. Just think about that a little bit. What gives rise to denominations? What comes to your mind? Doctrine? That it? What causes denominations? Divisions. That is almost universally what people will say. Divisions cause denominations. I really want to encourage you to think almost the opposite. It's not divisions, but unity that gives rise to denominations. Okay? Yeah, it would be nice if we had one giant church, everybody believes exactly the same thing, and then we wouldn't be talking about denominations and we wouldn't know what they are. And yes, if you go from 1 to 2, that's a division. However, if you compare, say, 100 denominations to 50,000 churches, which is more unified? What causes 6,000 congregations in the United States to unite under the banner Missouri Synod? What causes us to do that? Is it division? It's not division, actually. What gives rise to denominations is the fact that there is unity among various kinds of Christians. Now, they're not all unified with everybody else, but there are blocks of Christians that are unified, and they are unified in various ways. And that's why you have denominations. If that didn't happen, then you wouldn't have a denomination. There would be no reason to have a denomination, okay? If this was a business where we're all trying to make money together, then I would understand why you would want certain congregations to associate with one another. They make more money, okay? But that's not how it works. So if, in fact, there's no unity among us, what would be the point of us joining together with Zion or Friends in Christ or First and Little? I mean, what would be the point if there's no unity? Unity is what gives rise to denominations. Now, the lack of perfect unity is why there's not just one. But there's not an infinite number of denominations because there is still a great deal of unity among Christians. So the first thing I want you to bear in mind is that denominations arise because of unity among Christians, not because of disunity. Okay? Any thoughts on that? Because that's the number one thing you're going to get is denominations happen because of division. Therefore, denominations are bad, and therefore I don't want to have anything to do with them. That's what it sounds like. Sure seems like that makes sense. But if you phrase it differently and you say, well, denominations are because of unity, because we share things with all these other Christians, we're going to join together with them. That's a much more positive way of looking at it, and that's actually the more accurate way of looking at it. Denominations don't just come because we just happen to pick randomly out, you know, we need to have so many churches in Montana and so many churches in Iowa. No, that's not what happens.
Well, if you did have denominations at all, wouldn't that be just chaos?
Well, that's what we're going to think about, because that's part of what you end up with, or what you're at least risking with the sort of non-denominational fervor that we have in our country. I mean, where does that lead? Now, let's ask a little bit another question. What are the functions of a denomination? We'll just talk about our own, but I mean, it would be similar with most other denominations. What does having 6,000 congregations join together, okay, what does that enable, support, or otherwise raise up that would not be the case if we all remain separate?
It reduces infighting.
Pardon me?
It reduces infighting. You know, these are what your basics are, and you can focus more on reaching out to others.
Well, that's interesting. It reduces infighting. But we might say, well, we have 6,000 congregations that don't bother getting together. We're not going to have any infighting at all. So that's a way to solve that problem. You might say that denominations cause infighting because there's an in to fight about. But you do make a good point. You can focus on other things because you're not focused on what? Yeah. So, okay, so here's the first thing. unity of doctrine and practice. Would it make sense to have a denomination where there is no unity of doctrine or practice? Every congregation sort of does it. That really doesn't make any sense, does it? I mean, pardon me?
Those are Unitarians.
Well, even Unitarians are unified by a Unitarian stance and sort of rationalistic, moralistic stance. You don't just have a collection of congregations that don't have anything to do with one another, but they decide to form an association. You could, but there's no reason to do it, so nobody does it. You might think about this. A purely congregational structure, for example, is what Southern Baptists ostensibly have. Do Southern Baptists have any unity of doctrine and practice?
Sure.
Yeah. Yeah, it's not as much unity in doctrine as we have, but they have a substantial amount of unity of doctrine and practice. You can get thrown out of a Southern Baptist convention, okay, for not being Southern Baptist enough. But if you drive home the idea of what Baptist theology is all about, that every congregation is its own sovereign thing, and many Baptists will point this out. They are, as far as they're concerned, the Southern Baptist Convention exists only for about a week every year or two or three or whenever they meet. And the rest of the time it doesn't exist. So they call it a Southern Baptist Convention. We gather together in convention, and when we're in convention, we're sort of acting together, But otherwise, we're just separate. But unity of doctrine and practice is very important. It doesn't make any sense to say, well, here's the Methodist denomination, but who knows what they believe. You go to another Methodist church, you have no idea what they believe. You expect that you go from Methodist to Methodist to Methodist. There are going to be certain things that are going to be similar. Otherwise, what's the point? So denominations actually build on unity, and so congregations that worship in a similar way and believe a similar way tend to want to be together because they are like-minded. What else? What other functions does a denomination serve?
Seminaries.
Okay, and I'm going to get to that. I'll tell you what. That's down here. I call it economy of scale. There are things that just can't be done by a single congregation. And one would be, you're not going to run a seminary or university. You're not going to produce a hymnal. You're not going to be able to acquire the kind of expertise, for example, and resources that we can gather if you have, a couple of million people in one denomination. So it gives us some abilities that no individual congregation can do, and if we join together, then that's good, and that redounds to the benefit of us all. This goes back to the unity. The Missouri Synod is able to operate 2 seminaries where they exclusively train Lutheran pastors. We don't get Lutheran pastors from Dallas Theological Seminary. Okay? Other denominations do. It's kind of odd, but many denominations, they don't have their own seminaries. You just go to a seminary somewhere in the country, and then when you get there, at Dallas Theological Seminary, you tell them what your denomination is, and you study according to that. We don't do it that way. We're not interested in training, Presbyterians. They can train their own. We're here to train Lutherans in Lutheran theology and Lutheran practice. Well, in order to do that, you have to have a lot of congregations that are able to gather together. If you want to have unity in your clergy so that they all have a similar kind of training, okay, then you're going to have an ability to sort of vet the people that are at seminary, make sure that you're being taught the right things, understanding the right things, have the right kind of temperament and personality, and so that when a congregation calls, they are calling from a group of people who have been sort of pre-screened. Right? So all of these are benefits of not being on your own. You don't want to have to hire a pastor by having an interview, and everything comes down to the interview. You have to ask him everything. Okay, accountability to others. This is extremely important. this congregation is accountable to other congregations, as it should be. We don't get to do what we want. We don't get to preach and teach what we like. We are answerable to other congregations. In a certain way, we're even answerable to the Southern Baptists down the road. I mean, not formally, but informally. But formally, we are answerable to other congregations. This is an extremely important role that denominations play. You could call it quality control, or discipline would be better, accountability, that congregations are not free to go where they want. But we go together. That's what synod means, to walk together. Okay? So that we have agreed that we are going to do certain things that others have agreed to do, and we're not going to do certain things that others have not agreed to do. Also, what difference does it make if you have agreement in doctrine if there is no accountability for that? So consider the difference between the Missouri Synod and the ELCA. In the Missouri Synod, congregations and pastors have to subscribe to the Book of Concord so that congregations and pastors know what one another are supposed to be preaching and teaching. In the ELCA, you have a sort of a limited subscription. That is to say, you subscribe to the Book of Concord insofar as you consider it biblical. Okay, well, that's from a legal point of view, that's a loophole. Well,
say that again.
Well, okay, I subscribe to the Book of Concord because it accords with Scripture. Okay. But if I'm in the ELCA, I'm going to subscribe to the Book of Concord insofar as it accords with Scripture. That means that if I consider that a part of the Book of Concord does not subscribe to Scripture, I don't subscribe to that.
And you make that judgment yourself.
Well, and there's the problem. How do you exercise any kind of accountability if I can opt out? If I can say, well, I don't actually believe in the real presence. It's just not my thing. I think the Book of Concord is wrong there. So if one person says, hey, you're not supposed to have, practicing homosexuals in the pulpit, and somebody does it, but there's no enforcement, what's the point of the agreement that you're not supposed to have practicing homosexuals in the pulpit? So what I'm saying is the unity of doctrine and practice doesn't matter if there's no enforcement or accountability. There's no such thing as unity of doctrine if you can, in fact, preach and teach whatever you like and nobody's going to say anything. Okay? So part of a denomination is to keep control. Now, when you say keep control and you think of, ironclad, iron-fisted, we're going to tell you exactly how to preach, but you should rather think that we're just not letting everybody wander off in their own direction. Lutheran means something. Presbyterian means something. Catholic means something. And because of that, there has to be some accountability and control here. Now, denominations happen because these things are important and necessary. In the church, accountability was necessary. Discipline was necessary from the earliest days. Now, any thoughts on this so far? Do you see how these things are kind of important? Some of them, you might say, are not just important, they're sort of essential. Now, as I said, the largest growth, some of the statistics that tell you how all churches are declining are a little bit disingenuous, or at least misleading, because it is true that all denominations are shrinking, but non-denominational churches as a whole are growing. Okay? So a lot of people are leaving denominations and joining non-denominational churches. Then they show up on surveys as no preference among the denominations. And that sounds like they're just not even a Christian. Well, they might not be, but they may also be just going to the local family, a Bible church, and so and they eschew the title of denomination, and so they sound like they've just given up on the whole thing. Let's think about that. When you run across these folks, what is the logic of non-denominationalism? What I mean by this is when you talk to somebody who is a virulent anti-denomination, I won't put it that way, but I mean, it is clear that they view denominations with suspicion, okay? And that they believe that being in a non-denominational church is a pure form of Christianity. You know what I'm talking about? Okay. What's the logic to that?
The differences don't matter. The differences are human created.
There are differences. So what? So there are differences between Lutheran, Catholic, Reformed. So what do we do? The logic is this. Think about it. If we can't have perfect unity, then what will we have? No unity at all. Since there are, and let's just take three: Lutheran, Catholic, Reform. Okay, let's just take three. Since there are three different basic sort of ideas out there, at least two of them must be wrong. Probably all three of them are wrong. The way to be pure, because in the Bible you don't see, right? In the Bible you don't see denominations.
Or the early church.
So what that means is, rather than having to choose among three, we'll simply make every congregation its own thing. Now, that's a strange bit of logic. I heard it likened this way. You go to a family, you got a big family, 25 people are gathered together, and you find that these 5 people are arguing with those 7 people over there, and your solution is, then I'll abandon all of you, and I'll never go back again and see any of you. If we don't all get along, then I won't have anything to do with anybody. That doesn't make any sense, but that's the kind of thought that's going on here. Since we have division, then the solution is to make every congregation its own thing. Effectively, what does that do? What does that make a congregation into? Think about this. Its own denomination. Its own denomination. Now, if a congregation is its own denomination, may I ask you, to whom is it accountable?
Its members.
Really? I mean, I don't know what the congregation believes. I don't know whether what they believe now is going to be the same thing that they believe 20 years from now or what they believed 20 years ago. I don't know how they decide that. And who's going to tell them they're wrong? You can leave if you don't like it. Fine. But the others are staying. So we're continuing. There's no control. There's no accountability. There's nobody above to say, hey, you can't do that. Your denomination to yourself, and unaccountable. Unaccountable. Yeah.
Well, aren't the non-denomination churches held together by the person that they're following? Because it seems to me that the one person, like Jack Hibbs, or there are several others that are the church.
Well, sure, but who's he accountable to?
To himself and God, I guess.
Yeah, to himself and God.
Yes.
That's right. Okay.
But you see that a lot.
If I am only accountable to God, okay, then that's not what I mean by accountability. I mean, what other human being am I accountable to? Okay, because unless God comes down here and informs you that I'm wrong, you just have to take my word for it. God told me I'm right. Okay. So if you tell me that you follow the Bible, how do you know you follow the Bible? Well, I'll be the judge of whether I follow the Bible. Well, then what that means is, well, you're like the prosecutor, there's also the judge. Okay? You're the judge and the jury. You get to make up the conclusion. You are answerable to nobody else to defend anything. What you say goes. The individual members might not like it. Fine, they can leave. But the congregation as a whole is not answerable to any other congregation. It is its own thing. Now, that is manifestly not safe, and not good, and not right, and is not more unity than denominations. At least in denominations, we have a limited number of divisions, and the divisions are fairly defined. Okay? This is what a Lutheran is. This is what a Presbyterian is. Okay? It's not whatever these two people think. It's this is what this is. This is what the arguments between them are long-standing. You can go and look it up and research it and think all about it, and there's not going to be any surprises. But when you've got just two people, this one belongs to this church, that one belongs to that church, each church makes up its own stuff as it goes along, how are you going to know? How would you like to travel the country and on a Sunday morning want to go to a church and have no idea what that church teaches? You just got to go in and find out. I hear that all the time. How do you know? Well, you got to go. You got to go and listen. I think that's funny. There's not too many people can listen and actually know what they're hearing. People tell me all the time things that are so manifestly and obviously unbiblical and terribly unsound, but they absolutely believe them because their churches tell them that. And then another church down the road tells them exactly the opposite, and all those people believe that too. Now, that's a problem. The problem doesn't get better when we multiply it by 10,000, which is what happens when every congregation gets to do its own thing. And although I can pick on the Baptists for every congregation being its own thing, actually they don't get to do all their own thing. Just try to baptize an infant in a Southern Baptist church and claim that you have the authority to do that. It won't work, okay? Somehow or another, there's going to be some mechanism there. Okay. Are denominations in the Bible?
Yes.
Okay, well, obviously, the word denomination isn't. And you don't have the idea of whether there's this church body and then that church body. But let me ask you these questions. Is there a concern for doctrine and practice in the Bible? No doubt about that. Is there a call for unity among Christians? Yes. Is there a concern about division?
Yes.
Yes. Are there examples of accountability?
Absolutely.
Yes. Okay. Now, if you have that, you're going to have a denomination, unless you have perfect unity. If we all agree on the same things, and there's nothing to do, then you're right. We will not have denominations if there is no disagreement. I got you there. So I agree that denominations are worse than perfect unity. I agree with that. But they are infinitely better than just letting every church chart its own course. Denominations are not just bad. They're actually mostly good. In fact, they're absolutely vital to the church, given that there are divisions. Since there are divisions, it's much better to have us broken down into big chunks where we can actually figure out what these different sides believe, and we can have intelligent discourse among one another. And you can tell me that you're a Presbyterian and I know what that's supposed to mean, and I can tell you I'm a Lutheran, you know what that's supposed to mean, and we can start there. That's much, much better that we be broken into big chunks than everybody for himself or every congregation for himself. So while there's no such thing as a denomination, of course, when people say that, that is a naive thing to say. It sounds erudite. It sounds like, oh, I never thought about that. You're right, it's not in the Bible. Praise teams aren't in the Bible either, but let's not worry about that. The thing is, of course there's no denominations in the Bible. How anachronistic would that be? But all of the stuff that this is why we have denominations, because a concern for doctrine, a call for unity, concern about division, and accountability.
Wasn't that the reason for many of Paul's letters too?
Okay, yes.
Congregations,
Yes.
let's get together. This is what you're supposed to be doing.
Yeah.
You're not supposed to be doing
Paul
this.
was not afraid at all to say you're wrong and you need to do it this way. We were just talking, we were reading in 1 Corinthians chapter 11 about communion, and remember how he excoriated the Corinthians. The thing that you're practicing here is not the Lord's Supper at all, and he goes on to correct them. But actually, remember also when the church spread to Antioch, the first Gentile church, and word got back to Jerusalem, which was sort of the mother church, the first thing that the apostles did, okay, is they dispatched Barnabas to go and check out what's going on. Okay? And Barnabas went and became the pastor of that church. And then Barnabas went and got Paul. Okay? And then later on there was a dispute about circumcision and whether Gentile Christians needed to be circumcised or whether they needed to keep the whole law of Moses. And what happened? All the apostles gathered together in what was called the Apostolic Council. This is in Acts chapter 15 to discuss the issue and basically issue a determination, which the congregations were expected to follow. And when Paul wrote to his various congregations, he did not consider that his words were advice that they might want to consider. There were times when he did do that, but he labeled it as such. Most of the time, he's telling them, this is what we believe and teach, and you're expected to be following this. Okay. Let's take this logic just a little bit further, because a lot of people do take the logic a little bit further. If a congregation is allowed to exist unaccountable to anybody, then why not me as an individual Christian? Why can't I exist unaccountable to anybody? Why is it that I'm accountable to the pastor of some congregation, but the pastor of that congregation is not accountable to anybody? Why should I be accountable to a congregation when that congregation can go where it wants and nobody can tell that congregation that it's wrong? Well, if that's the case, then maybe I can tell the congregation that it's wrong. Practically speaking, this is what happens. If I don't like this congregation, I go to that one. If I don't like that one, I go to another one. If I don't like any of them, I don't go to any of them. So where is the accountability? It's with the individual. Every individual just decides for themselves what they will and what they won't believe, what is and what isn't, what they think is biblical. So to take this logic to its conclusion, every Christian just sort of decides for themselves what it means to be a Christian, what your obligations and duties are, and what becomes of congregations. They go away. There's no need for them except as an association of people who just happen to like to get together. But this congregation is not designed to gather people who like one another so that we can see one another all the time. That's not it. There's a level of accountability where when you become part of a congregation, you are submitting to it. This isn't like against your will and you can't stand it, but you are basically saying, look, I want to be molded and to become more like what a Christian is, and this congregation is going to help me do that. That means that you are really placing yourself in the care of this congregation and of that pastor in that very important realm of your life. If you say, well, I'll come to this congregation, but I will make up my mind what I'll believe and what I won't, what I'll do and what I won't, well, what is that? I'll come here, but I'm not accountable. If I don't want to come, I won't come. Okay, that's fine. You can do that. You know what we call you? A visitor. Okay? You can visit. You visit every Sunday if you like. But if in the end you won't be told anything, you won't follow an example, you will decide for yourself every single thing, well, what that basically means is you are your own, judge. And that's not a healthy thing at all. Let's think about the difference between the situation that we have right now, where I'm talking to somebody, and in order to find out what they believe, I cannot just ask them what church they go to or what church they grew up in, because it doesn't matter. They're probably going to tell me there's half a dozen different churches that they had to do with, and if they say, well, which one do you identify with? Well, they'd say, well, really kind of all of them, or a little bit of each of them, or mostly this and mostly that, a little of that, if they even know. I mean, this is the typical. It's different now. If you talk to somebody who, you talk to a Presbyterian who knows they're a Presbyterian and why they're a Presbyterian, well, okay, they're going to tell you, and that's fine. And then they will tell me a lot. I am Presbyterian Church in America. We are a very conservative denomination, and we are Calvinist and Presbyterian in our polity, and that I'm all about that. Okay, you tell me that, and I know right away some points where we are going to disagree and some points where we're going to agree, and we can have a good old time. Share a beer together. If it's a Southern Baptist, we won't share a beer together. But we still, right away, are going to figure out, okay, here's the points of where we're probably going to have agreement. And here's some places where we're not. I got asked an interesting question yesterday. Let's see, how did this question go? Yes. Lutherans, question mark. Are you closer to Southern Baptists or Episcopalians? and of course, I heard that, and I said, now that's a hard question. That is a hard question. So the first thing I had to say is, okay, well, first off, what kind of an Episcopalian are we talking about? Because I might have nothing to do with an Episcopalian. I might say they're hardly even Christian. Maybe they're even not. On the other hand, if you have a very traditional-minded Episcopalian, it kind of depends because there are different kinds of traditional Episcopalians, but I might say we could be very close. Some Anglican doctrine is very, very Lutheran, in part because they got it from us and they adopted it. Some Anglicans, and I don't mean part of the theology, I mean there are whole Anglican churches that are really very Lutheran, actually, if you want to look at it. And other Anglican churches are really very low church, very sort of Protestant, and others are practically Roman Catholic. Now, this is how so it's hard to answer the question. So the best I could do is I said, well, if your primary concern is what Episcopalianism looks like in America, if your primary concern is do we take the Bible seriously, we are much closer to the Southern Baptists. If your question is what does our worship look like, then we're much closer to the Episcopalians. But there's no one answer to that. It really depends on what you mean. But those sorts of questions are always interesting. Comparing and contrasting denominations are tricky. So let's think about this. It is a lot more difficult when you have to evaluate every single person, all the combinations and permutations of things that a person might believe in their individual life, as well as all the different things that individual congregations might believe in the non-denominational world. They are infinite. And there's no way you can figure out what they are because they don't even naturally, rationally go together. But when you actually look at systematic theologies, and what I mean by systematic, I mean well-considered, well-thought out. I'm not saying all these theologies are correct in all their various ways, but they do tend to have an internal coherency. They go together. Then you don't have an infinite number of them. You have a few. So you have your sort of Roman Catholic and family. There are some associated with the Roman Catholic Church that aren't technically part of the Roman Catholic Church, so-called Uniate churches. They're mostly in the Middle East, things like that. They're odd, but they're there. But Roman Catholic, which is by far and away the largest single church. You have your Eastern Orthodox, which is that division in the church goes way, way, way back. I mean, it way predates the Reformation. The Reformation, as we think of it, is a Roman Catholic phenomenon. It's in the Western Church. Roman Catholic and Western are basically one and the same thing. And the Reformation was a reformation of the Western Church. It really did not affect the Eastern Church. Eastern Orthodox theology, and it has its own divisions, but it tends to be much less doctrinal, and its divisions are a little harder to put your finger on. In fact, even what Orthodox teach sometimes is hard to put your finger on. But like Roman Catholics, they are very sacramental also, and very wedded to ancient traditions and rites and ceremonies and so on like that. There's not a whole lot of Orthodox in the United States, so we don't talk about them much. But they're here. I mean, there's not like a negligible number. They are round and about, but they're not like around here. You know, you lift up a rock and there's a Baptist underneath. I don't know that there's anywhere in the country where you lift up a rock and there's an Eastern Orthodox. There might be a neighborhood, but not so much the whole area. Okay, then you have Lutheran. Lutheran is a whole. There are a lot of churches that follow this. Let me back up on this and make another point about denominations. Denominations can be formed because of doctrinal splits. Okay, we have doctrinal disagreement. But we have unity amongst ourselves, but a division with you. Okay? So I would rather focus on the unity that we have rather than division we have with you. But it's possible to have divisions in the church that are not doctrinal. They are administrative. They are for accountability. They are because if you're a Roman Catholic Pope, you cannot exercise control over 1.5 billion people. It's just, forget it. You're not even going to come close. So the Roman Catholic Church is actually made up of hundreds and hundreds of what are called particular churches. Particular churches don't mean congregations, but dioceses. Each diocese has its bishop, and each of these is obviously not autonomous to do whatever it wants. They are all under the Pope, but they basically administer themselves. And the bishop is like the Pope in that diocese. Okay? Well, why? Well, because to have a diocese in Little Rock is a manageable thing that you might be able to handle. To have a diocese for the United States, there's too many people there. And to just have one pope over the entire world, that's too much. So even if you had total doctrinal unity, if you're going to maintain any kind of accountability, it's got to be broken down. So you might have a variety of Lutheran churches that are in doctrinal agreement, but we're separate administratively. We say we're in altar and pulpit fellowship, which means that I can preach in their pulpit, they can preach in our, we can go commune back and forth, but we administrate or separately. And this happens often because of geography. So for example, Lutheran Church in Canada, or Lutheran churches in conservative Lutheran church. There's what's it called? The Inter-Lutheran Fellowship, I think, ILF, there's the Lutheran World Federation. That is the collection of Lutherans. It's largely the collection of liberal Lutherans. And then there's the ILF, and that's the collection of conservative Lutherans. Liberal conservative cuts across all denominations. It destroys whatever it touches. It doesn't matter what your denomination are. When liberalism touches it, it destroys it. So you have a whole bunch of congregations that are either in altar and pulpit fellowship. We believe the same things, we practice the same way, or we're close enough that we're not really concerned about that. However, you take care of your business, we'll take care of our business. Even the Missouri Synod is broken down into districts and circuits for administrative purposes. So there are some denominations that are broken up by geography or by ethnic background. You'll have this in a lot of denominations. Well, we have in the Missouri Synod, we have what's called the English district. You think, what's the English district? Well, once upon a time, it was the only district where English was what was spoken. Everybody else spoke German. Okay? So this was the English district. Well, now everybody speaks English, so now nobody knows what an English district is. But these people go back. Earlier, there were a number of synods that merged with the Missouri Synod, and they were largely ethnic. So, these were Norwegians or Swedes or whatnot like that, and they moved and they lived in this or that area. But we had very similar, identical theologies, and so we ended up merging. But mergers didn't always happen. Sometimes it was okay to kind of remain separate. But that doesn't mean we're arguing with one another. I don't know how I got on that. Okay, well, what I did is there are lots of Lutheran churches. Okay? Lutheran Church Missouri Synod is the largest conservative Lutheran church. But there are lots of other conservative Lutheran denominations, if you want to call them that. And so you could say that there's a Lutheran denomination, but then that Lutheran denomination is subdivided depending on nationality and other things. What I mean to say, though, is there is a Lutheran theology, and they all share that. Even the liberals share that in that. If I want to tell a liberal Lutheran where they're going wrong, okay, I will point to what Lutherans don't believe and teach, rather than what Presbyterians don't believe and teach, okay? So, in other words, you're screwed up as a Lutheran rather than screwed up as a Presbyterian. Fine. But there is such a thing as Lutheran theology. That's different than Orthodox theology. That's different than Roman Catholic theology. They obviously share much in common, but there are differences. And then you have for lack of a better word, Reformed. Reformed is sort of the next generation of Reformation that happened after Luther. It's mostly Calvinist, but not all Calvinist. Calvin is probably the single most important figure. There's no church that bears Calvin's name. There's no Church of Calvin or Calvinist church like a Lutheran church. It just historically didn't happen that way. But Calvinists, Arminian would be mostly Methodist and things like that. Oh, is it kind? Okay. And then there's some subgroups of Methodist. Charismatic actually kind of comes out of Methodism quite a bit. But these are all associated. So what I'm saying is, if you want to have a discussion with somebody about what kind of a Christian you are, I'm much more comfortable with somebody who's willing to go with one of those. And there are certain subtypes and all that. But I mean, if you want to tell me what kind of a subtype you are, at least I know generally where you're at. It's not just generally. I know all the large pieces. But if you can't even tell me, well, I'm non-denominational, you can't tell me where on that scale you fit, then you're telling me nothing. Oh, well, I just follow the Bible. I see. So you're the judge and jury. And is that what you're saying? I get to tell you that I'm following the Bible, and I get to tell you whether I'm following the Bible, and I get to tell you what the Bible means. That doesn't work. And that's not how you see it in the New Testament, and that doesn't make sense either. I'm going to quit because I'm accountable, okay? And if I don't quit, I'll get in trouble. So let's pray. Lord Jesus, we thank you for the unity that you do give to us among Christians. And Lord, yes, there are many disagreements and divisions among Christians, but Lord, help us to understand that there is still a great deal of unity, and that unity is much stronger when we bind ourselves together and accountable to one another, and together accountable to your word. Lord, grant that in our church that you would keep us, O Lord, faithful to your word and faithful to one another, that we may honor your name and glorify you by enhancing our unity with other Christians. We thank you for this, O Lord. Amen.